He didn't come back to make peace. He came back to finish something. Alessandro Moretti stepped off the train just before dusk, the city rising around him like a memory that refused to stay buried. Stone buildings, narrow streets, familiar corners soaked in old blood. This was where he had been betrayed. This was where his enemies still breathed. Revenge had a schedule, and Alessandro was never late. Years ago, he vanished without warning, leaving behind a city that whispered his name like a curse. In his absence, men grew bold. They took what was his. They believed time had softened him. Tonight he intended to remind them what fear felt like. He moved through the crowd unnoticed, coat buttoned high, expression carved from stone. Power followed him even without guards. Men like Alessandro didn't need an entourage to be recognized. The weight of what he was walked with him. And then, everything cracked. Across the street, outside a small cafe glowing with warm light, stood a woman he hadn't allowed himself to remember. Lucia Bianchi. For a moment, he thought his mind was betraying him. She looked older, tired, real. Not the woman frozen in memory, but someone shaped by years he wasn't part of. Her hand rested on a boy's shoulder. The boy laughed, wide and unafraid. Beside him stood a little girl, holding Lucia's other hand. Alessandro's breath stalled. The children turned at the same time. Two faces, two pairs of eyes. Dark, dark. Familiar in a way that had nothing to do with coincidence. His eyes. The noise of the street faded. Cars passed. Voices collided. But Alessandro stood still, rooted to the pavement as the truth forced its way into his chest without mercy. Lucia looked up. Their gazes met. Shock flickered across her face, then fear. Not for herself, for the children. She tightened her grip on their hands and turned away. Just like that, they disappeared into the crowd, swallowed by the city Alessandro thought he owned. He stood there long after they were gone, the cold settling into his bones, revenge suddenly feeling small in his hands. He had come back to destroy his past. Instead it had found him first. And for the first time since he built his empire on silence and fear, Alessandro Moretti understood something terrifying. Some legacies don't burn. They wait. Alessandro Moretti had been gone long enough for the city to forget the sound of his footsteps. That was the mistake. He stood at the edge of the river as night settled in, watching the lights fracture across the water like broken promises. This city had taught him everything. How to take, how to hold, how to punish without hesitation. It had also taught him how easily loyalty rotted when power stepped away. 5 years ago, he had vanished without a word. No farewell. No warning. Just absence. He left behind lieutenants who smiled too easily, partners who bowed too deeply, enemies who waited patiently for the throne to empty. In the silence that followed, they carved his empire into pieces and told themselves he would never return. They were wrong. Alessandro came back angry. Not loud anger. Not reckless rage. His was the kind that lived under the skin, cold and disciplined, sharpened by memory. He had spent years preparing for this moment, building alliances elsewhere, gathering names, tracing old betrayals with the patience of a man who understood that revenge, rushed, was just another kind of failure. The list was short. It always was. Men who had skimmed from the books. Men who had sold information. Men who had ordered deaths in rooms where Alessandro's portrait still hung on the wall. He knew where they would be tonight. The city had changed in small ways. New restaurants in old buildings. Different faces guarding familiar doors. But the bones were the same. The streets still curved the way they always had. Power still pooled in the same dark corners. Alessandro moved through it all with purpose. Coat collar turned up, expression unreadable. He didn't need to rush. The city was already holding its breath. A black sedan rolled to a stop beside him. The window slid down. "They don't know you're back," said the man inside. Old contact. Careful voice. Nervous eyes. "Not officially." Alessandro nodded once. "Good. They're meeting tonight. The ones you asked about." I know. Knowing was his advantage. He had learned long ago that information was the cleanest weapon. The car pulled away, leaving Alessandro alone again. He checked his watch. Still time. Enough to walk. Enough to remember. This was the street where he'd first learned how fear worked. The bar where deals were sealed with handshakes and broken later with bullets. The apartment above the tailor where a man had begged for mercy and been denied because mercy had a cost Alessandro couldn't afford back then. He had built himself piece by piece here. Burned away anything soft. Buried anything that hesitated. That was how you survived. Anger had carried him through exile. It had kept him sharp when loneliness crept in during long nights in unfamiliar cities. It reminded him why he couldn't go back to the man he'd once been, the one who believed love could exist beside power. Lucia's face rose unbidden in his mind, and he shoved it away. Not now. Tonight was about balance. About restoring order. About reminding the world that Alessandro Moretti did not disappear. He waited. He reached the edge of the old district, where the buildings leaned closer together and the lights grew dimmer. Somewhere inside one of those walls, men were laughing, drinking, making plans that included his absence. He almost smiled. The plan was simple. Observe first. Confirm loyalties. Then strike where it would hurt the most. Quietly, decisively. No chaos. No spectacle. Fear worked best when it arrived without warning and left no witnesses. Alessandro stepped into the shadows and became what he had always been. A ghost with a memory. Yet even as he reviewed every detail, every contingency, something unfamiliar pressed at the edges of his thoughts. A crack he hadn't accounted for. Two faces. A boy's laugh. A girl's small hand wrapped around her mother's. His jaw tightened. Revenge demanded focus. Demanded certainty. And for the first time in years, certainty was slipping. He told himself it meant nothing. That whatever he thought he saw earlier was a coincidence. A trick of distance and memory. He told himself he would deal with it later, after the blood was settled and the scales were even. But the city, which had never lied to him before, felt different tonight. Less welcoming. More watchful. As Alessandro Moretti disappeared deeper into the night, one truth followed him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. He had returned to reclaim his empire. But something far more dangerous had already begun to claim him back. Lucia Bianchi learned the truth on a quiet afternoon, the kind that pretended to be harmless. The apartment was too clean. That was the first thing she noticed. Alessandro liked order, liked everything in its place. But that day the silence felt staged, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He was supposed to be gone until evening. Meetings. Promises spoken into phones he never put on speaker. Lucia had told herself for years that not knowing was a kind of safety. She stopped believing that when she opened the drawer. It wasn't hidden well. Alessandro had never thought he needed to hide anything from her. That realization hurt more than what she found. Ledgers. Numbers that didn't belong to any legitimate business. Transactions written in a language that didn't need explanation once you saw the patterns. Payments followed by disappearances. Profits built on absence. Lucia sat on the edge of the bed and read until her hands began to shake. By the time the front door opened that evening, something inside her had already shut. Alessandro noticed immediately. He always did. The way she didn't ask how his day was. The way she didn't meet his eyes. He reached for her out of habit and she stepped back. "What is it?" he asked. She almost laughed at the simplicity of the question. They didn't shout. That was the strangest part. The truth didn't explode between them. It settled, heavy and final. She told him what she'd seen. He told her she didn't understand. He told her he had built everything for them. For their future. Lucia listened until she couldn't anymore. That night, when he fell asleep beside her, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, one hand pressed to her stomach. She had known for weeks. She hadn't told him because she wanted the moment to be pure. Because she wanted to believe there was still a version of their life that wasn't built on fear. Because some part of her hoped that if she waited long enough, the truth would soften. It hadn't. By morning, she understood something with terrible clarity. Love didn't make Alessandro safe. It made him dangerous in new ways. Lucia left before dawn. She took only what she could carry. No jewelry. No credit cards. Nothing that could be traced back to him. She walked out of the apartment where she had once imagined raising children and didn't look back, because she knew if she did, she would stay, and staying meant surrender. The city swallowed her easily. It always had. She changed her name first. Then her hair. Then the way she moved through the world. She learned how to pay in cash, how to keep her head down, how to choose neighborhoods where no one asked questions and everyone minded their own survival. When the nausea came, she endured it silently. When fear crept in at night, she reminded herself why she was doing this. Not for herself. Never just for herself. For them. The twins arrived during a thunderstorm in a public hospital where no one knew her history. Matteo came first, loud and impatient. His cry cutting through the room like a demand. Julia followed quietly, her eyes already open, watching as if she were taking notes on a world she didn't trust yet. Lucia held them both and cried without sound. They grew quickly. Faster than Lucia was ready for. Matteo with his restless energy. His need to run ahead and test boundaries. Julia with her careful observations, her habit of staying close, one small hand always searching for reassurance. They had Alessandro's eyes. Lucia noticed it the first time they looked up at her together. Identical expressions of curiosity and stubbornness. It felt like grief and relief tangled into one impossible feeling. She built a life small enough to defend. A modest apartment. Work she could do quietly from home. Parks at predictable hours. Routines that made the world feel less sharp. She taught the children their letters at the kitchen table. Cooked meals that didn't require much. Laughed with them in ways she hadn't laughed in years. She never spoke Alessandro's name. At night, when the city settled, Lucia sometimes allowed herself to remember the man he had been before power hardened him. The way he used to listen. The way he used to hold her like she was something worth protecting. Then she would look at Matteo and Julia asleep beside each other, and remind herself why she had disappeared. Men like Alessandro didn't let go. They waited. And Lucia knew, even in the years when nothing happened and silence pretended to be permanent, that one day the past would recognize her on a street corner. She just hadn't expected it to happen so soon. Or to hurt so much. Alessandro saw them again 3 days later. He hadn't planned to. The meeting had ended early. Too clean, too cautious. His enemies were circling, measuring him, unsure whether the ghost had truly returned. Alessandro welcomed their hesitation. It gave him space to think, which was dangerous in ways bullets were not. He walked instead of taking the car. The afternoon was pale and cold, the kind that stripped the city of color and left everything honest. He turned down a street he didn't recognize until he did, memory clicking into place like a lock. A bakery on the corner. A narrow park tucked between buildings. Ordinary. The kind of place men like him never belonged. That was where he saw them. Matteo was running ahead, boots scuffing the pavement, laughter spilling out of him without restraint. Julia followed more carefully, her steps measured, eyes alert. Lucia walked behind them, her gaze moving constantly, not afraid but vigilant. The way mothers learn to be. Alessandro stopped. This time, there was no distance to soften the truth. The boy's jaw. The girl's eyes. The way Matteo tilted his head when he laughed. The way Julia watched the world like it might lie to her. Alessandro had spent his life memorizing faces, reading threats, spotting weakness, identifying bloodlines. There was no mistaking this one. His blood answered before his mind did. The city continued around him, indifferent. Bus hissed to a stop. Someone argued on a phone. Dog barked. But Alessandro stood frozen as the impossible settled into his chest and refused to move. Lucia hadn't told him. The realization landed with brutal clarity. Not later. Not after. From the beginning. She had left carrying his children. A hand brushed his arm as someone passed too close. Alessandro didn't feel it. All he could see was Matteo tugging at Lucia's sleeve, saying something that made her smile despite herself. All he could hear was Giulia's quiet question, the one Lucia bent down to answer with patience. He had imagined fatherhood once, long ago, before the world demanded harder things of him. The thought had died quietly, buried under ambition and blood. Now it stood in front of him, breathing, laughing, entirely real. Lucia looked up. Their eyes met. There was no mistaking the recognition this time. Shock flashed across her face, sharp and bright. Then fear, not for herself but for the children. Alessandro saw it clearly. Saw the calculation. The instinct to run. She reached for Matteo and Giulia at the same time. "Come on," she said. Her voice steady in a way that betrayed how fast her heart must be racing. Alessandro took a step forward without meaning to. Lucia turned away. The movement was small, controlled, but it cut deeper than any insult. She positioned herself between him and the children with practiced ease, one hand on each of their shoulders. Matteo frowned, confused. Giulia looked back once, her eyes catching Alessandro's for the briefest moment. Something ancient and wordless passed between them. Then Lucia steered them down a side street and they were gone. Alessandro stood there long after. The shape of them burned into his vision. The revelation didn't arrive all at once. Came in waves. First disbelief. Then arithmetic. Timelines. Nights he remembered clearly. Now reframed with merciless precision. Lucia had been pregnant when she left. She had known. She had made a choice. Rage rose, sharp and immediate, but it had nowhere to land. It dissolved into something heavier, something quieter. He had children. Not heirs. Not leverage. Children. The word didn't fit in his mouth yet. That night, Alessandro returned to the apartment he was using and sat in the dark without turning on the lights. The city glowed beyond the window, vast and uncaring. He replayed the scene again and again, searching for some detail that would undo it. There was none. Lucia hadn't taken them to hurt him. He understood that now. She had taken them to save them. From him, from the world he ruled, from the consequences that followed his name like a shadow. For the first time since he had returned, revenge felt distant, abstract, because revenge required certainty. And Alessandro Moretti had just lost his. Somewhere in the city, a boy with his face was being tucked into bed. Somewhere, a girl with his eyes was asking questions he wasn't there to answer. He had come back to reclaim what was stolen from him. Instead, he had discovered what he had never known he was capable of losing. And this time, walking away was no longer an option. Lucia did not sleep that night. She lay awake listening to the soft rhythm of two separate breaths coming from the bedroom down the hall, counting them like prayers. Matteo shifted in his sleep, murmuring about something only he understood. Giulia slept curled inward, one hand tucked beneath her cheek, as if guarding a secret. Lucia watched the ceiling and waited for the sound she had been expecting for years. Knock. Phone call. Footsteps outside the door. Nothing came. By morning, she knew it wouldn't stay that way. He changed their routine. No park. No bakery. She kept the children close, her hand never leaving their reach. But even as she moved through the day, fear gave way to something heavier. Inevitability. Alessandro had seen them. A man like him did not unsee. The message arrived just after noon. We need to talk. No name. No number she recognized. It didn't matter. Lucia stared at the screen until the words blurred. Part of her wanted to throw the phone away, to pack a bag and disappear again. She had done it once. She could do it again. But Matteo and Giulia were older now. Roots had begun to form. Running would cost them something she couldn't replace. She typed back a single line. 1 hour. Public place. The cafe was small and busy, the kind of place where no one looked too closely at anyone else. Lucia chose a table near the window, positioned so she could see the door and the street beyond. The children sat beside her, crayons spread between them, oblivious to the tension coiled tight in her chest. Alessandro arrived exactly on time. He didn't wear a suit. No polished armor. Just a dark coat, collar turned up. His presence heavy even before he spoke. The room seemed to quiet around him, not because anyone recognized him, but because some instincts didn't require names. Lucia stood. "You shouldn't be here," she said before he could open his mouth. His gaze flicked to the children, then back to her. Controlled. Careful. "We need to talk." "No," she said quietly. "You need to leave." Matteo looked up, curious. Giulia's eyes narrowed slightly, already assessing. Alessandro took a breath. "Lucia." Hearing her name from him again felt like a bruise pressed too hard. "You don't get to say it like that," she replied. "Not here. Not now." He lowered his voice. "They're mine." The words landed between them like broken glass. Lucia laughed once, sharp and humorless. "No, they're not." His jaw tightened. "They have my face. They have a life," she shot back. "One you were never part of." Alessandro stepped closer, then stopped himself. The restraint was new. Showed. "You took them from me." "I saved them," Lucia said. Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. "I saved them from waking up one day and realizing their father ruled through fear. From growing up thinking violence was inheritance. You didn't give me a choice." "I did," she said. "You just didn't like it." Matteo tugged at her sleeve. "Mama." Lucia knelt immediately, smoothing his hair. "It's okay," she said softly. "Finish your drawing." Alessandro watched the interaction like a starving man watching someone else eat. "I didn't know," he said, and for the first time, the words didn't sound like an excuse. They sounded like a wound. "If I had known." "You would have stayed," Lucia cut in. "And they would have grown up inside your world. Your enemies. Your deals. Your blood." He shook his head. "I could protect them." "You are the danger," she said, not cruelly, but with exhausted certainty. Silence stretched between them, thick and unbearable. "I want to know them," Alessandro said finally. "That's all. I'm not asking for anything else." Lucia stood, placing herself fully between him and the children. "No." The finality in her voice was absolute. "You don't get to walk into their lives because fate surprised you on a sidewalk," she continued. "You don't get to rewrite their story because yours caught up with you." His eyes darkened. "They're my children. Biology doesn't make you a father," she said. "Being there does. And you weren't." The truth hit him harder than anger ever could. Lucia gathered the crayons, her hands steady despite everything. "You will stay away from us," she said. "If you don't, I will disappear again. And this time you won't find us." She took Matteo's hand. Giulia reached for the other without being asked. They walked past him without looking back. Alessandro remained standing long after the door closed behind them, the sounds of the cafe slowly returning around him. He had faced guns without flinching, built empires from nothing, broken men with a word. But nothing had prepared him for this. For being told with quiet certainty that he was a father, and that he was already too late. Alessandro kept his distance, not because Lucia had threatened him, though she had, but because getting closer felt like crossing a line he didn't yet understand. He told himself this was restraint, strategy, the kind of patience that had kept him alive for decades. Still, every afternoon around the same hour, he found himself parked across the street from the park. The first time he didn't get out of the car. He lowered the window just enough to hear the sounds drift in. Children shouting, a ball bouncing, a dog barking at nothing. Ordinary life, unfolding without fear. Without him, Matteo was easy to spot. He moved like he was constantly racing something only he could see. Climbing too high, running too fast, laughing too loudly. Giulia stayed closer to Lucia, her eyes always scanning, taking in details, filing them away. When she laughed, it was softer, like she was testing whether joy was safe. They were exactly how Alessandro imagined they would be. And nothing like he expected. He watched Matteo fall once, skinning his knee. Before Alessandro could even tense, Lucia was there, already kneeling, already soothing. Matteo cried for half a second, more out of surprise than pain, then nodded solemnly as Lucia cleaned the scrape. Julia held his hand the entire time. Alessandro felt something tighten in his chest. This was not a world that needed him. He came back the next day. And the next. Always at a distance. Always silent. He learned their rhythms the way he once learned patrol patterns. Matteo favored the swings first, then the slide. Julia liked the bench near the tree, where she could watch other children without being forced into play. On Thursdays Lucia brought snacks. On Sundays they stayed longer. Once, Matteo kicked a ball too far and it rolled toward Alessandro's car. The boy chased it, stopping just short of the curb. He looked up, curiosity bright in his eyes, and Alessandro's breath caught painfully in his throat. For a moment, Matteo stared at him, head tilted, studying his face like it might tell him a story. Lucia called his name sharply. Matteo turned and ran back. Alessandro didn't move for a long time after that. At night, the city felt louder. The apartment emptier. He replayed the days in his mind, each small moment etched with unbearable clarity. He had commanded men. He had ordered lives erased. Yet the thought of a boy kicking a ball and a girl watching clouds undone him more thoroughly than any enemy ever had. He began to leave things behind without meaning to. A new soccer ball appeared at the park one morning, bright and untouched. Lucia noticed it immediately, her posture stiffening as she scanned the area. Alessandro stayed hidden. Matteo claimed it with a shout of victory. Julia smiled once, quick and knowing, as if she sensed intention where no proof existed. Another day, a book appeared on the bench Julia favored. Lucia frowned. She took it home anyway. Alessandro told himself these were harmless gestures, that he wasn't crossing lines. But lines had already blurred. He started planning differently. Meetings shortened. Retaliation delayed. When his men spoke of tightening control, Alessandro hesitated, not from weakness but calculation. Violence echoed, spread, and anything that spread might reach the park. He couldn't allow that. One evening, rain began suddenly, scattering families in every direction. Lucia hurried the children along, coats pulled tight. Matteo slipped on wet pavement, and Julia cried out before Lucia could react. Alessandro was out of the car before he realized he'd moved. He stopped himself 2 steps in. Lucia saw him. Their eyes locked across the rain, the moment suspended and fragile. Alessandro raised his hands slightly, a silent promise. I won't come closer. I won't touch. I won't break this. Lucia hesitated. Then she nodded once, sharp and small. It was the closest thing to trust he had ever earned. That night, Alessandro sat in the dark and understood something with terrifying clarity. Revenge had once given his life shape, purpose, direction. But now, watching from the shadows, knowing Matteo's laugh and Julia's quiet patience, revenge felt like noise, like a distraction from something that mattered more. He wasn't part of their lives, but he was no longer outside them either. And somewhere between the distance he kept and the bond he felt growing stronger with every silent afternoon, Alessandro Moretti realized that the most dangerous thing he had ever done wasn't returning for revenge. It was staying. Revenge began to feel like a language Alessandro no longer spoke fluently. It crept up on him in small, unsettling ways. A name would surface in a meeting, someone who had betrayed him years ago, and the familiar heat would rise, sharp and precise. But before he could give the order, Matteo's laugh would intrude, uninvited, or Julia's quiet stare, and the heat would cool, leaving something dull and uncertain behind. His men noticed. They didn't question him openly. They never did. But they watched him more closely now, searching his face for the cues they'd once relied on. Alessandro Moretti had always been predictable in one way. When he decided, things happened. Swiftly. Permanently. Lately he decided less. He delayed a strike that would have sent a message across 3 neighborhoods. He redirected resources away from old vendettas and into quiet, defensive measures. Surveillance increased near the park, though no one knew why. Weapons were moved farther from places that mattered, though only he understood which places those were. He told himself it was strategy. That patience would make the eventual blow more devastating. But deep down he knew the truth. Every act of violence felt like a risk now. Every ripple carried the possibility of reaching Lucia. To Julia. That possibility was unbearable. One evening, Alessandro stood alone in his apartment, staring at a map spread across the table. Pins marked territories. Lines traced old alliances and newer fractures. This had once felt like a living thing. His creation, his proof of existence. Now it looked fragile, temporary. Me. He thought of Lucia's words. You are the danger. For the first time he didn't reject them outright. He remembered the man he had been when he built this empire. Hungry, furious, convinced that power was the only shield worth carrying. He remembered how easy it had been to justify each step. Someone always deserved it. Someone always started it first. But Matteo and Giulia hadn't started anything. They had simply existed. And in doing so they had undone him. The realization frightened him more than any enemy ever had. Because it meant that the thing he had built his life around, revenge, dominance, control, could no longer be his compass. It pointed him in directions that led straight through the people he was trying, desperately, to protect. Alessandro poured himself a drink and didn't touch it. He went back through old memories, searching for the moment when revenge stopped being about justice and became habit. About identity. He wasn't sure when the shift happened. Only that somewhere along the way he had mistaken survival for purpose. The next day a message came in. One of the men he had sworn to destroy was exposed, vulnerable, practically offering himself up. The kind of opportunity Alessandro once would have seized without hesitation. He stared at the message for a long time. Then he deleted it. The decision sent a tremor through him. Not relief, not satisfaction, but loss. As if he had set something down and wasn't sure who he was without it. That afternoon he went to the park. He didn't sit in the car this time. He stood across the street, partially obscured by a line of trees, far enough away that Lucia wouldn't feel crowded. Matteo was chasing pigeons, arms outstretched, convinced he could catch one if he tried hard enough. Giulia sat beside Lucia, listening intently to something her mother was saying, her face serious with concentration. Alessandro watched, his chest tight. This was the life he had never planned for. Unremarkable. Sacred. Revenge could burn cities. He had seen it happen. But it could never build this. When Lucia glanced up and spotted him, she stiffened. Alessandro raised his hand slightly, then lowered it, staying exactly where he was. After a moment, she turned back to her children. She didn't smile. But she didn't leave either. That night, Alessandro lay awake and understood that the question facing him was no longer how to take revenge. It was whether he was willing to lose everything else to keep chasing it. Revenge had once given his life meaning because it was all he had. Now it threatened to take away the only things that had ever made him feel human. He didn't know yet what choice he would make. Only that the man who had returned angry was beginning to disappear. And in his place stood someone far more dangerous to the world he had built. A man who had something to lose. The first sign came quietly. A car Alessandro didn't recognize idled too long at the corner near the park. Nothing overt. No tinted windows, no obvious watchers. Just a vehicle that appeared twice in one afternoon where it didn't belong. Alessandro noticed because noticing was instinct, honed by years of survival. He told himself it meant nothing. The second sign came that night, in a meeting room filled with men who had once feared him without question. One of them spoke a little too confidently. Another avoided his eyes. Information arrived late. Answers came rehearsed. Predators sensed hesitation the way sharks sensed blood. Alessandro had hesitated. Word traveled fast in his world. Not facts, never facts, but impressions. Alessandro Moretti was different. Slower. Distracted. The rumor took shape without anyone saying it aloud. The ghost had returned, but something had followed him back. By the third day he knew. Lucia felt it too. She noticed it in the way strangers lingered too long on the sidewalk outside her building. In the way a man on the bus asked an unnecessary question about the children's school. In the way Julia clutched her hand tighter than usual, eyes darting, already learning lessons Lucia had hoped to delay. That afternoon, Lucia cut their time at the park short. Alessandro saw it happen from across the street. The sudden stiffness in her posture. The way she gathered Matteo and Julia without explanation. The way her gaze swept the surroundings, sharp and calculating. Fear. Not imagined. Not remembered. Current. Alessandro didn't follow them. Instead, he followed the feeling crawling up his spine. He scanned rooftops. Reflections in windows. The flow of people moving just a little too deliberately. Someone was watching. That night the message arrived. Not to his primary phone. Not through his usual channels. It came on a number he hadn't used in years. A number only a handful of people even knew existed. You've grown soft, Alessandro. No signature. He stared at the screen, pulse steady, mind racing. Another message followed. Beautiful children. Be a shame if they learned who their father really is. Something cold and lethal unfurled inside him. This wasn't a challenge. It was a threat. Alessandro moved faster than he had in weeks. Orders were issued in clipped tones. Surveillance doubled, then tripled. Men were reassigned, not to enforce territory, but to watch shadows. Every familiar route Lucia took was quietly mapped. Every exit, every blind spot. He hated himself for needing to do this. Hated the truth beneath it even more. His world had found them. Lucia received her warning the next morning. A folded note slipped under her door. No name. No demand. Just 4 words written in careful ink. He can't protect you. Lucia sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. Matteo was at the table, coloring with furious concentration. Julia looked up immediately, her gaze sharp, searching her mother's face. What is it? She asked. Lucia forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Nothing, amore. But she knew. She had always known this moment would come. Men like Alessandro dragged danger behind them no matter how far they ran from it. She packed a bag that afternoon. Not everything. Just enough. Alessandro arrived at the park too late. The bench was empty. The swing still. The silence wrong. Panic hit him like a physical blow. He didn't think. He moved. Lucia was halfway down the street when she saw him. She stopped, every muscle coiled, Matteo pressed against her side, Julia gripping her coat. They're watching, she said before he could speak. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her. This is what I tried to prevent. I know, Alessandro said. And I won't let it happen. She shook her head. You already have. The words cut deep because they were true. Car engine revved nearby. Too close. Alessandro positioned himself without thinking, placing his body between Lucia and the children and the street. The motion was instinctive. Protective. Olden knew all at once. Lucia stared at him, something like realization flickering across her face. This ends now, Alessandro said quietly. For all of us. Sirens wailed somewhere in the distance, unrelated, but sharp enough to remind him how thin the line had become. His enemies hadn't made their move yet, but they would. They always did. And as Alessandro stood there, feeling the weight of 2 small lives breathing behind him, he understood the final truth with brutal clarity. Revenge had painted a target on his back. Love had painted it on his children. And this time, walking away wasn't just impossible. It was unforgivable. Alessandro had always believed there were only 2 kinds of choices. The ones that made you powerful. And the ones that made you dead. He understood now how wrong that had been. The meeting took place in a room he once ruled without raising his voice. The same long table. The same men seated in the same order. Faces that had aged under his command, some with loyalty carved deep, others with ambition barely concealed. They watched him carefully. Rumors had reached them all. Whispers of hesitation, of distraction, of weakness. In this world, those words were invitations. Alessandro didn't sit at the head of the table. That alone unsettled them. "There's a problem," one of the men said finally, testing the air. "Our rivals are pushing. They think you're distracted." Alessandro nodded once. "They're right." A ripple moved through the room. Another man leaned forward. "Then let us handle it. Say the word." Alessandro looked at them, really looked. Men who had killed on his orders. Men who had built their lives inside the gravity of his decisions. This empire had demanded everything from him. Blood. Pieces of his soul he had convinced himself he didn't need. And now it demanded one thing more. The children's faces rose unbidden in his mind. Matteo's reckless laughter. Giulia's watchful eyes. Lucia standing between them and the world like a shield made of will. Alessandro spoke calmly. "I'm stepping away." The words landed like a dropped weapon. Silence. Then disbelief. Then anger. "You can't," someone said. "This is yours." "It was," Alessandro replied. "It isn't anymore." A chair scraped back. "If you walk away, everything collapses." "Yes," Alessandro said simply. They stared at him as if he had lost his mind. He hadn't. He had finally found it. "You built this," another man said, quieter now. "You don't just leave." "I'm not leaving," Alessandro corrected. "I'm ending it." The room erupted. Accusations. Threats. Promises of chaos. Alessandro let them speak. He listened the way he used to listen to enemies before deciding who lived. When the noise died down, he laid out the truth. Counts. Safe houses. Evidence collected over years. Kept as insurance against betrayal. Enough to dismantle everything they thought protected them. Enough to burn the empire to the ground without firing a single shot. "If anything happens to my family," Alessandro said, his voice low and steady, "this all goes public. Every name, every crime, every secret." They understood then. This wasn't abdication. It was a controlled demolition. Alessandro stood and left them with the wreckage. By nightfall the city shifted. Money froze. Lines went dead. Alliances unraveled. The empire that had once moved at Alessandro's command began to eat itself, collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. Lucia felt it before she saw it. The pressure eased. The watchers vanished. The streets grew quieter. Alessandro came to her building without warning. No guards. No armor. Just a man who looked older than he had a week ago. She didn't invite him in. "What did you do?" she asked. "Enough," he said. She studied him, searching for the lie. She found none. Only exhaustion. Resolve. "You destroyed everything," she said softly. "Yes. And if they come for you." "They won't," Alessandro said. "There's nothing left to take." Matteo appeared behind her, curious. Giulia followed, cautious but unafraid. Alessandro didn't step closer. Lucia's voice broke despite herself. "Why?" He answered without hesitation. "Because power isn't worth their lives." The words hung between them, fragile and irrevocable. Lucia looked at her children, then back at him. For the first time, she didn't tell him to leave. Alessandro walked away that night with nothing. No empire. No protection. No guarantees. But as he disappeared down the street, the city no longer felt like it was hunting him. Felt like it was letting him go. The empire he had built to survive was gone. And in its ashes, something far more dangerous to the man he used to be had taken root. A future that could be lost. The city did not mourn the fall of Alessandro Moretti's empire. It adjusted. Money found new routes. Power shifted hands. Names once spoken in whispers lost their weight. Buildings still stood. Streets still filled. Violence, like water, flowed around the absence and kept moving. Alessandro watched it all from a distance he had never allowed himself before. Days passed without gunfire. Nights passed without meetings. For the first time in his adult life, he woke without a plan carved in blood. The quiet was unfamiliar, almost painful. It left room for things he had trained himself not to feel. Regret. Hope. Fear. Lucia let time do what anger could not. She didn't forgive him. Not in words, not in gestures. But she stopped packing bags. She stopped scanning every room for exits. The tension in her shoulders softened, just enough to breathe. Alessandro did not move back into their lives. He existed on the edges, close enough to be seen, far enough to be safe. He walked Matteo to school once, standing a step behind, letting Lucia take the lead. Matteo talked non-stop, filling the air with questions and observations, completely unbothered by the man walking beside them. When they reached the gate, Matteo turned, smiled, and waved. Alessandro stood there long after the bell rang. Giulia took longer. She watched him carefully, eyes sharp, weighing every movement. One afternoon, she approached him without warning and held out a drawing. House. 3 figures. One standing slightly apart. For you, she said. Alessandro accepted it like something sacred. He never raised his voice again. When trouble surfaced in the city, small, manageable threats, he didn't step in. He had chosen this life knowing it meant surrendering control, letting others make their own mistakes, letting consequences unfold without his hand guiding them. It was harder than any war he had fought. Lucia spoke to him one evening as the sun lowered itself behind the buildings. "They ask about you," she said quietly. He nodded. "What do you tell them?" "That you're someone who made mistakes," she replied, "and tried to fix them." Alessandro swallowed. It was more grace than he deserved. He never told them about the empire, about the bodies, about the cost of his choices. Some truths were weights children didn't need to carry. Weeks turned into months. Alessandro found work that required no violence, no secrets, paid little and demanded much. It left his hands tired and his conscience quieter. At night, he returned to a small apartment with bare walls and slept deeply, unguarded. One afternoon, Lucia invited him to stay for dinner. Not as a test, not as forgiveness, as a beginning. They ate together at a small table that wobbled slightly if leaned on too hard. Matteo talked with his mouth full. Giulia corrected him patiently. Lucia watched them both, her eyes soft in a way Alessandro had never seen before. Afterward, when the children went to bed, Alessandro stood to leave. "You can stay," Lucia said. He hesitated. "Only if it's safe." She met his gaze. "It is." That night, Alessandro lay awake listening to the sounds of a life he had almost destroyed. The hum of the refrigerator, the quiet footsteps of Lucia checking on the children, the steady breathing through the walls. He understood then that violence always left something behind. Sometimes ruins, sometimes ghosts, sometimes, if you were willing to lose everything else, space for something better. Alessandro Moretti no longer ruled anything. But when Matteo ran to him in the mornings, and Giulia leaned against his side when she thought no one noticed, he felt a weight settle into place that power had never given him. The empire was gone. What remained was smaller, fragile, uncertain, and worth protecting with every breath he had left.